The Roman world stretched across a vast and varied landscape, covering lands that touched 3 continents and bordered 2 great bodies of water. To the north lay dense forests and cold rivers. To the south, the warm sands of the African coast. To the east, ancient cities and fertile plains. And at the center of it all, a narrow sea that the Romans would come to call their own, the Mediterranean, which in their language simply meant the sea in the middle of the world. The land of Italy itself, where all of this began, is shaped like a long boot extending southward into that quiet sea. Along its spine runs a chain of mountains, the Apennines, gentle and weathered, covered in forests of oak and chestnut. The western coast is softer, with rolling hills and river valleys where the soil is rich and dark. The eastern shore is steeper, dropping more quickly toward the Adriatic. The whole peninsula is neither too large nor too small, just wide enough to sustain many different peoples, and just narrow enough that a single city, given time and patience, could eventually reach across it all. That city, of course, was Rome. It sat along the Tiber River, a slow and winding waterway that moved through the hills of central Italy before emptying into the sea some 20 miles to the west. The city did not begin on level ground. It grew instead across 7 hills, low, rounded prominences that gave early settlers a natural advantage, places to watch from, places to shelter in, places where the air moved a little more freely than in the marshy lowlands below. The Tiber beside them was not a dramatic river. It was brown and calm most of the year, useful for trade and for drinking, wide enough to matter, small enough to cross. In the very earliest centuries, before there was anything resembling an empire, Rome was simply one of many small communities scattered across the central Italian hills. The Latin people who settled these hills were farmers and herders, people who kept sheep and grew grain and built their homes from timber and thatch. They worshipped gods of the earth and sky, of rain and harvest, of the hearth and the threshold. Their world was small and quiet. The rhythms of the seasons governed nearly everything: when to plant, when to rest, when to gather in what had grown. Over many generations, the community along the Tiber grew. It absorbed neighboring villages. It entered into agreements with other Latin towns. It developed its own sense of identity, its own customs, its own way of organizing itself. A small council of older men, the Senate, gradually became the place where decisions were made. Assemblies of citizens gathered to vote on matters of common concern. Leadership passed between elected officials whose terms were short and whose powers were checked by others alongside them. The Romans were not in a hurry. The habits of governance that they built took centuries to solidify, and they were shaped all the while by failure as much as by success. For a time, in those early centuries, Rome was actually ruled by kings. These were not distant, unknowable monarchs. They were men who lived within the city, who could be seen and spoken to and, if necessary, challenged. 7 kings ruled in succession, some remembered as wise, others as harsh. The last of them, a man remembered for his cruelty, was eventually removed from power by a group of Roman nobles who decided that the city would be better governed without a king at all. This happened slowly, as a gradual shift in thinking rather than a sudden rupture. And after it, Rome became a republic, a word that in their language simply meant the public thing, the shared concern of all citizens. The Republic lasted for nearly 5 centuries. During that long stretch of time, Rome grew from a city-state into something far larger, though no one in the early years would have predicted just how large it would eventually become. The growth was gradual. First, Rome consolidated control over the nearby Latin communities. Then it extended its influence northward into the lands of the Etruscans, a sophisticated people who had built walled cities across the hills of what is now Tuscany, people who knew metallurgy and trade and who left behind painted tombs filled with images of feasting and music. Then Rome turned south, into the Greek-influenced communities of the Italian peninsula's toe and heel. With each expansion came new customs, new words, new ways of doing things. The Romans were not simply conquerors in the blunt sense. They were also adapters. When they encountered something they admired in another culture, they often absorbed it. From the Etruscans they took certain religious practices, certain styles of building, even the art of reading omens in the flight of birds and the organs of sacrificed animals. From the Greek cities of the south they absorbed philosophy, rhetoric, and a deeply felt appreciation for art and architecture. This habit of borrowing and adapting would become one of the defining characteristics of Roman civilization, the ability to take in something foreign and make it, over time, thoroughly Roman. The army that carried out all of this expansion was not, in those republican centuries, a professional standing force in the modern sense. It was drawn from the citizens themselves. Roman men of a certain property level were expected to serve when called upon, to bring their own equipment, and to fight in the organized formations that Roman military thinking had developed. The basic unit was the legion, a large body of infantry, typically several thousand men, organized into smaller units called cohorts and centuries. Each legion had its own identity, its own standards, its own sense of pride. The soldiers of the Republic fought in a particular way, standing close together, using short swords and large shields. The shield was rectangular and curved, designed to interlock with the shields of neighboring soldiers, forming a nearly continuous wall of wood and metal and leather. Behind this wall, or advancing from it, a legionary could operate in tight coordination with the men beside him. The formation was not flashy or fast. It was methodical and steady. It moved forward with a certain heaviness of purpose, absorbing pressure and then exerting its own. Against the looser formations of many of Rome's enemies, this disciplined steadiness proved remarkably effective. Training was an ongoing part of military life. A Roman soldier was expected to march long distances, often carrying not just weapons and armor but also tools for building camp. At the end of each day's march, wherever the army stopped, it would construct a fortified camp, digging a ditch around the perimeter, throwing up a rampart of earth, setting wooden stakes along the top. This was done even when no enemy was nearby, because the habit of building security was considered more important than the question of whether security was strictly needed. The discipline required to do this, day after day, march after march, was itself a kind of training. Officers in the Roman army ranged from elected politicians who commanded legions for a year or two as part of their civic careers, to professional soldiers who had spent decades in the ranks. The centurions, officers responsible for companies of roughly 80 men, were the backbone of Roman military organization. They were often experienced, promoted from within, respected for their steadiness under pressure. A good centurion was worth a great deal to a Roman army, more perhaps than any single commander. As the Republic expanded, it developed systems for managing the territories it acquired. Some areas were made provinces, directly administered by Roman governors appointed from among the senatorial class. Others were left to local rulers who had made agreements with Rome, who acknowledged Roman authority and in return were allowed to continue their own forms of governance. The empire that eventually emerged from the Republic did not impose a completely uniform system on every place it touched. There was, instead, a kind of layered complexity, Roman law and Roman authority at the top, but beneath that, a great deal of local variation in language, custom, and daily life. The Mediterranean world that Rome came to dominate was already, before Roman expansion, a place of considerable trade and movement. Ships crossed the sea carrying grain and olive oil, wine and pottery, timber and metals. Merchants from dozens of different peoples mingled in port cities. Greek was spoken across much of the eastern Mediterranean as a common language. Ideas about philosophy, medicine, and mathematics moved along the same routes as trade goods. Rome entered this world and, over centuries, became its organizing center, not by erasing what existed, but by providing a framework of law, roads, and security within which exchange could continue and, in many respects, expand. The roads that Rome built were among its most lasting contributions to the landscape. They were not simply paths worn into the ground by repeated use. They were engineered constructions, graded, drained, and surfaced with layers of carefully chosen materials. A properly built Roman road had a foundation of large stones, then a layer of smaller rubite, then a surface of flat-fitted paving stones, all slightly raised in the center so that rainwater would drain to the sides. Along major roads, stone markers told travelers how far they had come from Rome, which was considered the measuring point for all distances. The phrase that all roads lead to Rome was not merely metaphorical. The road network was genuinely designed around the capital as its hub. Traveling by Roman road was slow by modern standards but remarkably reliable for the ancient world. A message could travel from one end of the empire to another in a matter of weeks. An army could be moved with surprising efficiency. Merchants could plan their journeys with some confidence that the road would be passable, that bridges would exist where needed, that inns and stopping points would appear at regular intervals. The road network created a kind of connective tissue through which the empire breathed and functioned. The city of Rome itself, at the height of the empire, was home to perhaps 1 million people. It was one of the largest cities the ancient world had ever seen, crowded and layered and enormously complex. The center of the city was the Forum, an open public space surrounded by temples, administrative buildings, and the Rostra, a platform from which public speeches were delivered. Around the Forum clustered other fora, built by various emperors over the centuries, each adding its own collection of temples and monuments and meeting places. This central district was a place where civic life concentrated, where people came to conduct business, to watch ceremonies, to hear news. Moving out from the center, the city became denser and more residential. Most Romans did not live in houses. They lived in apartment buildings called insulae, multi-story structures that could reach 5 or 6 floors in height. The upper floors were cheapest, reached by wooden staircases that could become dangerous in the frequent fires that swept through sections of the city. The lower floors, closer to the street and cooler in summer, cost more and attracted wealthier tenants. The ground floor of an insula often contained shops opening directly onto the street, bakeries, metalworkers, fullers' establishments where cloth was cleaned and processed, wine shops with their large clay vessels set into stone counters. The streets of Rome were narrow and often unpaved in the residential neighborhoods, though the major thoroughfares were paved and maintained. Traffic moved through them all hours. During the day, the streets were crowded with pedestrians, vendors, litters carrying wealthy citizens, and the general noise and press of urban life. Carts were generally prohibited from the city center during daylight hours to reduce congestion, so much of the heavy hauling of goods happened at night, filling the streets after dark with the grinding of iron-rimmed wheels on stone. Water was one of Rome's great achievements. The city was supplied by a series of aqueducts, long structures that carried water from springs and rivers in the hills outside the city, across valleys on arched stone viaducts, and into the city at a steady gradient that allowed the water to flow by gravity alone. The engineering required to maintain a consistent slight slope over distances of many miles, through varied terrain, was considerable. Once inside the city, the water was distributed to public fountains, to the great public baths, to certain private buildings, and to the fountains that dotted the city's neighborhoods. Public baths, the thermae, were central to Roman daily life in a way that can be difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective. They were not merely places to wash. They were social spaces, places where Romans of many different backgrounds came together to bathe, to exercise in the courtyard, to talk, to conduct business, or simply to pass a comfortable hour or two. A large imperial bath complex might include not only the bathing rooms, the cold room, the warm room, and the hot room, but also libraries, gardens, lecture spaces, and colonnaded walkways. Entry was cheap, and in some cases free. The baths were visited regularly, usually in the afternoon before the main meal of the day. The process of bathing in a Roman bath was itself a gradual, unhurried experience. A visitor might begin in the changing room, leaving their clothing under the watchful eye of an attendant. Then progress through the warming rooms, allowing the body to adjust to rising heat. The hot room, called the caldarium, was steamy and warm, and visitors would scrape oil and sweat from their skin using a curved metal tool called a strigil rather than soap. Then back through the warm rooms and eventually into the cold plunge pool, a bracing conclusion to the process. The whole ritual could take an hour or more and left the visitor feeling, as many ancient writers described it, thoroughly refreshed. Food in Rome and across the empire varied considerably depending on one's wealth, location, and season. For most ordinary Romans, the diet was fairly simple: grain in various forms, particularly bread and porridge, supplemented by legumes like lentils and chickpeas, vegetables, olives and olive oil, some fish and cheese, and occasional small portions of meat. Wine mixed with water was drunk widely, considered safer and more agreeable than plain water from uncertain sources. Garum, a fermented fish sauce with a pungent, deeply savory flavor, was used in cooking almost the way salt or soy sauce might be used today, added to dishes to deepen their flavor. Bread was baked in communal ovens throughout the city, sold at bakeries whose stone-ground millstones were often turned by donkeys walking in circles in the back. Loaves varied in quality and price. The cheapest bread was dark, made from less refined grain, while lighter, whiter bread was more expensive. Archaeologists have found carbonized loaves at Pompeii, the city near Naples preserved by volcanic ash, still bearing the marks of the baker and still divided into 8 portions by lines scored across their tops before baking. The morning began early for most Romans. The day was divided not into fixed hours of 60 minutes as we measure now, but into 12 hours of daylight and 12 of night, which meant that the length of an individual hour changed with the seasons. Summer hours were longer, winter hours shorter. Work and activity typically began at sunrise. The early hours of the morning were given to business, visits, the various duties of daily life. Wealthier Romans received clients and associates who came to greet them and conduct various exchanges of favor and obligation, a system called the morning salutation, which was a daily expression of the social bonds that held Roman society together. Children in Roman cities often began their education young. Elementary schooling might happen in a quiet corner of a forum or under the shade of a colonnade, with a teacher and a small group of students gathered around tablets covered in wax, into which letters were scratched with a pointed stylus. Reading and writing in Latin, and for many children in Greek as well, was the foundation of a Roman education. Numbers and basic calculation followed. For children from wealthier families, education continued with more advanced literature, rhetoric, the art of speaking persuasively and well, and philosophy. The Roman calendar organized time in a way that divided the year into months marked by particular days of significance. The calends was the first of the month. The Ides, famously, fell in the middle, the 15th of March, May, July, and October, and the 13th of other months. Religious festivals were scattered throughout the year, and there were many of them, days set aside for particular gods, for rituals of purification, for games, for processions, for communal feasting. The calendar was as much a religious document as a practical one, reminding Romans of the cycle of obligations and observances that connected them to their gods and to each other. Religion permeated Roman life without dominating it in the way that a single organized religion might. The Romans worshipped many gods: Jupiter, ruler of the sky; Juno, his consort; Mars, associated with war but also with the agricultural cycle; Venus, with love and beauty; Mercury, patron of travelers and merchants; Neptune, of the sea; Minerva, of crafts and wisdom. There were many others, and the list grew over time as Rome absorbed the deities of the peoples it encountered. Temples to various gods dotted every Roman city. Shrines stood at crossroads, inside homes, in workshops. The household had its own religious life, centered on small shrines called laria where offerings were made to the lares, the protective spirits of the family and the home. A Roman household might begin and end the day with a small ritual at this shrine: a pinch of incense, a small cake or portion of food, a quiet moment of acknowledgement. The spirits of ancestors were also honored, considered present in some meaningful sense within the family. Religious life was woven into the texture of daily existence rather than set apart from it. Across the empire, the variety of local religious practice was enormous. In Egypt, the ancient traditions of that civilization continued alongside Roman customs, with temples to Isis and Osiris functioning much as they always had. In the Eastern Mediterranean, Greek religious traditions persisted. In the western provinces, Spain, Gaul, Britain, local Celtic deities were sometimes identified with Roman gods, creating merged figures who carried elements of both traditions. A dedication might be made to Mars Tutatis, combining the Roman god of war with a Celtic deity, as if acknowledging that in their deepest nature, perhaps, these figures were the same. The provinces themselves were extraordinarily varied in character. Gaul, roughly corresponding to modern France and Belgium, was a land of rolling hills, rivers, and forests, its people skilled in metalwork and trade. After Julius Caesar's campaigns brought it firmly under Roman control in the 1st century before the Common Era, Gaul was gradually incorporated into the Roman world, developing cities, adopting Latin, and eventually becoming one of the most thoroughly Romanized regions outside Italy. Cities like Lugdunum, which we now call Lyon, grew into prosperous centers with amphitheaters and baths and forums. Britain, an island off the northwestern coast of the continent, was added to the empire in the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era, under the Emperor Claudius. It remained a frontier province throughout Roman rule, its northern boundary marked by Hadrian's Wall, a stone fortification that stretched across the width of the island. The wall was not primarily meant to be a defensive line in the manner of a modern barrier, but rather a controlled boundary, a place where movement between the Roman province to the south and the unconquered lands to the north could be regulated. Along its length were forts and smaller installations, each housing garrison troops who patrolled the surrounding area and watched the passes through the hills. Life on the frontiers of the empire had a particular character, more military, more provisional, more oriented toward watching and maintaining rather than toward the civic flourishing of the interior. But even on the frontiers, the marks of Roman culture appeared. A garrison town might have its own small bathhouse, its own temples, its market days and its officers' quarters furnished with imported pottery and wine. The soldiers who served on the frontiers came from all across the empire. An inscription at one fort on Hadrian's Wall records soldiers from as far away as Syria, and they brought their own customs and gods with them, adding to the layered mix of cultures that characterized Roman frontier life. The army had changed considerably by the later centuries of the empire from its republican origins. Where once it had been a citizen militia called out when needed and then sent home, by the imperial period it had become a professional force of career soldiers who enlisted for terms of 20 to 25 years. Service was demanding, long marches, garrison duty in unfamiliar lands, the slow pace of military routine broken occasionally by the sharp urgency of conflict. A soldier who completed his service received upon discharge a diploma, a set of bronze tablets certifying his honorable record and granting certain legal privileges, including the right to contract a legal marriage and to pass citizenship to his children. Pay was modest but regular, supplemented by occasional bonuses paid at moments of imperial celebration. A soldier's daily expenses for food and equipment were often deducted from his pay, so what remained was not large, but it was reliable. Many soldiers managed to save, and upon retirement some settled near the forts where they had served, in the civilian communities that had grown up around Roman military installations. These communities, called vici, could be quite substantial, with their own markets, temples, and residences, home to the families and dependents of soldiers who could not officially be recognized while a man was still in service. Cities throughout the empire shared certain common features regardless of where in the Roman world they happened to be. The forum at the center. The temples to the gods, particularly to Jupiter and to the divine Augustus. The basilica, a large covered hall used for legal proceedings and business. The theater, for dramatic performances. The amphitheater, where gladiatorial displays and wild animal hunts were staged. The baths. The market building. These were the standard elements of a Roman city, and their presence in towns across Spain, North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Britain marks the reach of Roman culture more clearly perhaps than anything else. The amphitheater at Nimes in southern Gaul still stands today, its great oval of stone looking much as it did when it was built nearly 2,000 years ago. The same is true of the amphitheater at Verona, and of several others scattered across the former Roman world. These buildings were enormous. The Colosseum in Rome itself could hold tens of thousands of spectators, and they were built to last, with carefully engineered arches distributing weight downward into the earth. The games held within them were a form of public entertainment that the imperial government provided as a matter of political custom, keeping the population of the city engaged and connected to the spectacle of imperial power. Gladiatorial combat, which the modern imagination often renders in terms of brutal savagery, was in reality a more complex institution. Gladiators were often slaves or prisoners of war, but some were volunteers who saw an opportunity for fame and financial reward. They were trained in schools that took their health and conditioning seriously. A well-trained gladiator represented a significant financial investment, and the owners of these schools preferred their fighters to survive and compete again. The mortal outcomes that popular imagination emphasizes were real but not constant. Many bouts ended with both fighters still alive. One acknowledged the victor, the other's fate determined by the crowd and the presiding official. The animals brought into the arena for the venations, the wild beast hunts, came from across the empire and beyond its borders. Lions from North Africa. Bears from the forests of the north. Leopards and elephants and rhinoceroses from places most spectators had never seen and would never visit. These displays served, among other things, to demonstrate the reach of Roman power and the richness of the world it commanded. To see an exotic animal in the arena was to see, in some sense, the world made manifest in Rome. Theatre was a gentler form of public entertainment, its roots deep in the Greek tradition that Rome had absorbed and made its own. Performances ranged from comedies, which were extremely popular and often involved stock characters in domestic situations of mistaken identity and romantic complication, to more serious dramatic forms. Theatre was performed outdoors, in the daytime, before large audiences. Actors wore masks that indicated their characters at a glance and amplified their voices in the open air. The texts of the great Roman comic playwrights Plautus and Terence have survived intact through the centuries and are still performed today. Music was present throughout Roman life, though almost none of the actual music survives for us to hear. Instruments appear in mosaics and in carved reliefs: lyres, flutes, water organs, various wind and percussion instruments. Music accompanied religious ceremonies, theatrical performances, military marching, and private celebrations. There were professional musicians who performed at banquets and festivals, and there were gentlemen amateurs who played for their own pleasure. The Emperor Nero is remembered, perhaps unfairly, largely for his passion for musical performance, which his critics considered inappropriate for a ruler but which he himself regarded as a serious artistic pursuit. Banquets among the wealthy were elaborate social occasions, and the literature of the Roman world is full of descriptions of them. Guests reclined on couches arranged around low tables. The Romans ate lying on their sides, supported on one elbow, a posture that strikes modern readers as unusual but was associated in the ancient world with leisure and sophistication. Food was served in courses, with various dishes circulating through the gathering. Conversation was expected to be witty and informed. A host demonstrated his wealth and cultivation through the variety and quality of what he offered, but also through the company he assembled and the quality of the entertainment, musicians, readers, perhaps a philosopher willing to offer a short discourse between courses. Wine was an essential element of the Roman banquet, served mixed with water in varying proportions. Pure wine was considered rather barbaric, fit perhaps for people who did not know better, but not for civilized Romans. Different wines from different regions of the empire had different reputations. Wines from the area around Naples were considered among the finest. Wines from Spain and Gaul were produced in enormous quantities and traded widely. Wine was stored and transported in large ceramic jars called amphoras, which have survived in great numbers across the former Roman world. Broken fragments of amphoras, their thick walls and handles scattered across archaeological sites from Britain to Egypt, silent testimony to the enormous scale of ancient trade. The sea, of course, was the great highway of this trading world. Ships of various sizes and designs crossed the Mediterranean and the coastal waters beyond it, carrying goods in both directions. The sailing season ran roughly from spring to autumn, when winds were more predictable and weather less dangerous. During winter, the seas were considered unreliable enough that major voyages were typically avoided. This seasonal rhythm shaped trade and movement throughout the Roman world. Winter was a time of settling in, of using what had been gathered during the more active months, of waiting for spring to open the routes again. A merchant's ship of the Roman period was a sturdy, deep-hulled vessel, its sail a large square or a combination of sails, driven before the wind. These ships could carry substantial cargoes. Archaeologists have found shipwrecks preserved on the Mediterranean seafloor whose holds were packed with hundreds of amphoras, their contents of wine or olive oil or fish sauce long since dissolved but their shape still precise in the mud. Navigation relied on experience, on knowledge of landmarks and winds and currents passed down through generations of sailors, and on the position of the stars on clear nights. The harbors into which these ships sailed were busy, noisy places, warehouses and loading docks, customs officials collecting taxes on goods, merchants arguing prices, cranes lifting cargo from ships' holds. Ostia, the port city at the mouth of the Tiber that served Rome itself, has been extensively excavated and reveals the texture of this commercial world with remarkable clarity. Its streets still show the mosaic floors of the offices of shipping associations from various parts of the empire, each decorated with images of the ships and products associated with their trade. Travel by road, for those not moving heavy cargo, was the other great mode of movement through the empire. A traveler setting out from Rome might ride a horse or travel in a carriage, or simply walk, depending on means and purpose. The road would take them past farmland and vineyards, through small towns with their inns and temples, past milestones counting out the miles. At night they might stop at a mansio, a government-maintained inn on the major roads primarily intended for official travelers, or at a private company, somewhat more modest establishments where food and a place to sleep could be obtained. The countryside through which these roads passed was itself a working landscape, intensively cultivated in many parts of the empire. Italy and Sicily were major grain-producing regions, though Egypt became under Roman rule an enormously important breadbasket. its Nile Delta flooding annually to deposit fresh silt that made the fields extraordinarily productive. North Africa, modern Tunisia and Libya in particular, produced olive oil in staggering quantities, its landscape covered in olive groves maintained by a labor force of tenant farmers and slaves. Spain produced wine and olive oil as well, and its mines yielded silver and other metals that flowed toward the center of the empire. The question of slavery in the Roman world is impossible to avoid and difficult to discuss without recognizing its weight. Slavery was pervasive and fundamental to the Roman economy. Slaves worked in mines under terrible conditions. They worked as agricultural laborers on the great estates that dominated parts of the Italian and provincial landscapes. But they also worked as skilled craftsmen, as teachers, as doctors, as administrators. A wealthy Roman household might contain dozens of slaves performing every conceivable domestic function. A slave with particular skills or education might occupy a position of some trust and responsibility, even as they remained, legally, a piece of property. The system was not gentle in any of its forms, even when individual relationships within it might have some dimension of mutual regard. Freed slaves, known as liberti, occupied an interesting position in Roman society. A freed slave retained certain obligations to the former master who had freed them, but they also gained legal standing and could conduct their own affairs, own property, and enter into contracts. Their children, born after manumission, were free citizens with full legal status. Over generations, the descendants of freed slaves were fully integrated into the citizen body. Some freedmen accumulated considerable wealth through commerce, and a few became genuinely powerful. Certain emperors relied heavily on talented freedmen as administrators, which sometimes drew criticism from the traditional senatorial class. The structure of Roman society was layered and complex. At the top sat the senatorial class, wealthy families whose men could hold the highest offices and command armies. Below them, the equestrian order, also wealthy, but engaged more typically in commerce and in the administrative positions that senatorial tradition considered beneath its dignity. Then the broader mass of citizens, the plebs, differentiated among themselves by wealth and occupation and local standing. At the bottom, slaves. Between these layers, movement was possible but not easy, and the categories were maintained by law, custom, and the weight of inherited expectation. Women in the Roman world occupied a position that, like so much in Roman life, varied considerably by class and individual circumstance. Legally, adult women were under the authority of a male guardian, father, husband, or other male relative for many legal transactions. But in practice, particularly among the wealthier classes, Roman women had considerable latitude in managing households, conducting business, and shaping social life. Some women of the imperial family wielded genuine political influence, operating through their relationships with emperors and senators. The daily life of ordinary women, the woman who ran the bakery, the weaver, the market seller, was shaped more by the immediate demands of work and family than by the formal structures of law. Marriage was understood primarily as an alliance between families, particularly among the upper classes, and was often arranged with economic and social considerations in mind. Weddings were occasions for celebration and ceremony, marked by particular rituals: the signing of the marriage contract, the procession to the new home, the carrying of the bride across the threshold. The legal age for marriage was quite young by modern standards, especially for girls. Companionate ideals of marriage, based on mutual affection and respect, are visible in some surviving letters and inscriptions, while other sources suggest relationships more transactional in nature. The relationship between a Roman family and its departed members was maintained through an active set of practices and observances. The dead were buried or cremated outside the city walls, along the roads leading away from the city. Roman law required this separation of the living from the dead. Tombs lined the roads in the vicinity of every Roman city, some simple markers, others elaborate structures speaking of wealth and the desire for lasting remembrance. Inscriptions on tombs addressed passers-by directly, asking them to pause and read and remember, sometimes describing the life of the person within, sometimes recording the grief of those left behind. The Parentalia was a festival in February during which families visited the tombs of their ancestors to make offerings of wine, flowers, and food. This was not a solemn or frightening observance but a family occasion, a time when the bonds between the living and the dead were acknowledged and renewed. Similar in spirit was the Lemuria in May, during which a householder performed nighttime rituals to propitiate wandering spirits. The dead were present in Roman religious thinking not as purely remote figures but as beings who retained some connection to the living and who required attention and care. One of the most striking features of the Roman imperial system, looking back at it across the centuries, is its longevity. The period we typically identify as the Roman Empire, from the reign of Augustus onward, lasted in the West for roughly 5 centuries and in the East considerably longer. For most of those centuries, the basic structures of Roman governance, the roads, the cities, the legal system, the military, continued to function. Individual reigns might be troubled, individual regions might suffer, but the overall organism was remarkably persistent. The emperors who governed through these centuries were a varied collection of human beings. Some were experienced soldiers who governed effectively for decades. Some were young men elevated by circumstances of birth and dynastic accident who proved unequal to the task. Some were capable administrators who left their most lasting marks not in military campaigns but in legal reforms and building projects. Hadrian, who ruled in the 2nd century, is remembered for his wall in Britain but also for his extensive travels throughout the provinces, his personal interest in Greek culture, and a reign of relative peace and stability. His predecessor Trajan had expanded the empire to its greatest geographical extent through campaigns in Dacia and Mesopotamia, but it was Hadrian who largely chose consolidation over further expansion. The great philosophical tradition of Stoicism found many of its most devoted practitioners among the Romans. Seneca, advisor to the Emperor Nero, wrote extensively about the cultivation of inner calm, about accepting with equanimity the things that cannot be changed, about the proper relationship between the individual and the world. Epictetus, a slave who later gained his freedom, taught that the only things truly within our control are our own judgments and responses, and that wisdom lies in understanding this distinction clearly. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled the empire for nearly 2 decades in the latter half of the 2nd century, kept a private journal of philosophical reflection, writing to himself about patience, about duty, about the transience of all earthly things, about the importance of acting rightly without concern for recognition or reward. This journal survives and is still widely read, a quiet testament to a man who carried enormous responsibility and sought, through daily reflection, to carry it well. The language of the empire was never entirely one language. Latin was the language of administration, of law, of the army, and of public life across the western provinces. But Greek remained dominant throughout the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, Syria, Greece itself. The cities of Asia Minor all continued to use Greek as their primary written and spoken language. An educated Roman was typically expected to be comfortable in both. Many works of Roman literature were composed in direct imitation of or response to Greek models. Virgil's Aeneid drew on Homer as its explicit model. Roman philosophy worked largely within frameworks established by Greek thinkers. The two cultural traditions were deeply intertwined, each enriching the other. Architecture in the Roman world borrowed from Greek models but developed its own distinctive features and capabilities. The arch, which the Romans used with extraordinary facility, allowed them to span spaces in ways that Greek post and lintel construction could not. The vault and the dome followed from the arch, enabling the construction of large covered spaces, bath halls, basilicas, and eventually structures like the Pantheon in Rome, whose great concrete dome, open at its crown to let in a single round shaft of daylight, still stands essentially intact and still impresses all who stand beneath it. Concrete was another Roman innovation that enabled their characteristic architecture. Roman concrete, known as opus cementitium, was made by mixing volcanic ash, particularly a type found near Pozzuoli in the Bay of Naples, with lime and water, then using rubble as aggregate. This mixture, when it set, became extraordinarily strong and durable, harder in many ways than the stone it sometimes replaced. It could be poured into forms of any shape, allowing a freedom of architectural design that earlier materials had not permitted. The Pantheon's dome is made of this concrete, as are the foundations of countless buildings across the Roman world, many still underlying later constructions erected in the centuries after Rome's power had faded. Water management, both for cities and for agriculture, was another field where Roman engineering achieved remarkable results. Beyond the great aqueducts that fed the cities, Roman engineers constructed drainage systems, land reclamation projects, and harbor improvements throughout the empire. Marshes were drained to create farmland. Rivers were channeled and bridged. Harbors were deepened and enclosed with moles and breakwaters. The physical landscape of the former Roman world still carries the marks of these interventions in ways that remain visible to a careful eye. Mining was an important part of the Roman economy, providing the metals needed for coins, for tools and weapons, and for the decorative arts. The silver mines of Spain were particularly significant, worked on a very large scale through the labor of thousands of slaves. Gold was obtained from rivers and mines in various parts of the empire. Iron was smelted from or found throughout the northern provinces. Lead, which the Romans used extensively for pipes and vessels and as a solder in their water systems, was mined in Britain and elsewhere. The scale of Roman mining was large enough that traces of the resulting pollution, lead particles and other metals, can be detected in ice cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet, a faint chemical trace of Roman industry preserved in ancient ice. The crafts of the Roman world were extraordinarily varied and often highly skilled. Glassblowing, developed in Syria in the 1st century before the Common Era, spread quickly through the Roman world and allowed the creation of thin, translucent vessels in a range of colors and forms. Pottery was produced in large quantities at certain centers. The red glassware called sigillata, made at workshops in Gaul and Italy and North Africa, was distributed across the entire empire in enormous volumes, its distinctive bright red surfaces bearing impressed designs of figures and plants. Mosaic floors covered the rooms of wealthy houses across the Roman world, their tiny tesserae of stone and glass assembled into images of extraordinary delicacy, hunting scenes, mythological tableaus, portraits of the dining room's owners or of the gods they honored. The landscape of Rome itself changed continuously over the centuries of the empire's existence as successive emperors left their marks on the city. Augustus boasted that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, a rhetorical exaggeration, perhaps, but not entirely without truth. His building program transformed the center of the city, adding temples, restoring old structures, and giving the city a grander visual presence. Subsequent emperors added their own contributions. Vespasian and his son Titus began and completed the Colosseum. Trajan added a new forum of enormous scale, its central column carved with a continuous spiral of relief sculpture depicting his Dacian campaigns. Hadrian rebuilt the Pantheon. Constantine, in the early 4th century, added his great triumphal arch. The passage of time within the empire had its own texture. Decades accumulated. Children grew up in a world shaped by institutions their parents had grown up within. The legions that had marched under Augustus continued to march under Nero and Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius, carrying their traditions and their eagles. The Senate met each year in its familiar buildings. The aqueducts flowed. The games were held on the appointed days. There was, despite all the surface turbulence of politics and dynastic change, a quality of continuity in Roman life that gave it a particular feeling of permanence, a sense, shared by many Romans, that the order they inhabited was not a temporary arrangement but a natural state of affairs, the way the world was and would continue to be. This feeling of permanence was expressed in architecture, in law, in the language of inscriptions that recorded public works and dedicated temples for eternity. When a Roman official had a new aqueduct built, the inscription commemorating the work was cut into stone and meant to endure. When a citizen erected a tomb, the words carved on it addressed all future readers as if across an unbridgeable but navigable distance. There was something in Roman culture that worked persistently against the acknowledgement of change, that preferred the language of stability and continuation. And yet change came, slowly and then more quickly. The 3rd century brought a period of unusual instability, a long succession of short-reigning emperors, military pressure on several frontiers simultaneously, economic disruption and plague. The empire did not fall during this period. It reorganized, reformed its military and administrative structures, and continued. Diocletian, who came to power near the end of the 3rd century, conducted a thorough reorganization of the empire's administration, dividing its governance between multiple co-rulers and reforming the tax and monetary systems. Constantine, who followed some decades later, moved the empire's eastern capital to a new city built on the site of a Greek town on the Bosphorus, a city that would eventually come to be called Constantinople. The acceptance of Christianity as a legitimate and then as a favored religion under Constantine's reign brought changes to the texture of Roman religious life that accumulated gradually over subsequent generations. Temples that had stood for centuries were closed or converted. The philosophical and ethical frameworks of Christian teaching began to shape law and social thought in new ways. But this transformation, too, was gradual rather than sudden. Rome did not become Christian overnight, and the old practices persisted in various forms long into the period when Christianity was nominally dominant. The western half of the empire, centered on Rome itself, experienced increasing pressure in the late 4th and 5th centuries from groups moving across its borders: Goths, Huns, Vandals, others whose names have passed into history. These groups were not simply external enemies. Many had long relationships with Rome, serving in the army, living within the frontier zones, participating in the economic and cultural life of the empire in complex ways. The political and military changes of this period, which eventually resulted in the deposition of the last Western emperor in 476 of the Common Era, were real, but their meaning and their impact on daily life were not uniform across the Roman world. In many places, Roman life continued with only gradual change. Cities that had been Roman for centuries kept their forums and their baths, their bishops and their markets. Latin continued to be spoken, slowly evolving into what would eventually become the Romance languages: French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian. Roman law was preserved in legal codes that would shape European legal thought for more than 1,000 years. The Eastern Empire, centered at Constantinople, continued to exist as a genuinely Roman state for another 1,000 years beyond the fall of the West, its continuity a reminder that the Roman world did not end at a single moment but rather transformed, slowly and across an enormous span of time, into the worlds that followed it. What remains of Rome is everywhere, if one knows how to look. In the shape of cities built along Roman roads that still follow the same routes across the landscape. In the words of the Latin-descended languages that hundreds of millions of people speak today. In the legal principles preserved in codes that ultimately trace their ancestry to Roman jurists. In the architecture of government buildings and churches that borrowed Roman forms. In the names of the months, preserved from the Roman calendar. In the distant memory, encoded in language and custom and place, of a civilization that once organized a vast portion of the world according to its own particular habits and ideas. The fields where Roman legions once marched are quiet now. The aqueducts, where they still stand, carry no water but cast long shadows across the countryside in the afternoon light. The mosaic floors beneath the soil of European and North African cities wait for the careful brush of the archaeologist. The Tiber still moves slowly through Rome, brown and unremarkable, indifferent to the centuries that have accumulated on its banks. The 7 hills are still there, lower than they seem in imagination, rounded and covered now with 2,000 years of building upon building, the deep foundations of the ancient city resting at the bottom of everything, quiet and permanent beneath the weight of all that came after.